The first glimpse. It was a lonely night on a deserted road when Caleb Montgomery saw the faint glow on the horizon. Exhausted from hours of driving and hopelessly lost, he was relieved to find what looked like a small village up ahead. He approached it, drawn in by the warm glow of streetlights and the inviting outlines of quaint, old-fashioned cottages nestled between thick trees. The place didn't appear on any map, but Caleb felt an inexplicable urge to enter. The sign read, "Welcome to Raven's Hollow, established 1801, in ornate, weathered letters." Oddly, the air seemed to grow colder as he stepped into the village. A fog rolled in, dense and unnatural, but Caleb pressed on, desperate to find shelter. The inn at the village center had a flickering vacancy sign in the window. An old woman greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, handing him a brass key and whispering, "Best to stay indoors after dark." Ignoring her warning, Caleb dropped his bags in his room and decided to explore the village before everything closed. But as he walked the narrow cobblestone streets, an unsettling silence blanketed the area. No distant hum of life, no murmur of voices, only the faint echo of his footsteps. It was as if the village held its breath, waiting for something sinister to unfold. As Caleb wandered, he noticed strange carvings etched into the sides of the buildings, symbols of eyes, hands, and what looked like swirling mists. His curiosity grew, and he ducked into a small bookstore with dimly lit shelves. The smell of age and dust filled the air as he ran his fingers along cracked spines, searching for anything that might explain the carvings. The storekeeper, a thin man with hollow eyes, handed Caleb an ancient book bound in faded leather. "The History of Raven's Hollow," it read. Caleb flipped through the brittle pages, finding tales of a village cursed by a terrible event, a fire that had ravaged the town 2 centuries ago, leaving nearly every resident dead or missing. Locals believed the souls of the villagers were trapped between worlds, bound to Raven's Hollow and cursed to vanish each night at midnight, taking all who remained with them. That night, unable to shake the unsettling stories, Caleb stayed awake, watching the clock tick closer to midnight. The inn seemed to breathe with him, the air thick with a growing tension. At the stroke of midnight, an unnatural silence swallowed the village. The lights flickered, and shadows began to dance across his walls, shifting as if alive. When he peeked outside, the entire village appeared to be swallowed by darkness. The streets faded, buildings became hazy outlines, and a chilling fog began to creep through the cracks of his window. Caleb recoiled, feeling an unshakable dread, and realized the horrifying truth: he was the only one left in this desolate void. A faint voice whispered through the fog, calling his name, urging him to come outside. Caleb's heart raced, and he locked the door, pushing a chair against it. But as he turned, he saw his own reflection in the mirror twist into a ghastly visage, a version of himself with hollow eyes, pale skin, and a mouth that stretched into a sinister grin. His reflection whispered, "Once you've seen the village at night, there's no leaving." When the fog finally lifted at dawn, Caleb stumbled outside, feeling as though he'd been trapped in a nightmare. The village looked exactly as it had the night before, but an eerie calm lingered in the air. He searched for the innkeeper, the storekeeper, anyone who could reassure him that he wasn't losing his mind. But the villagers avoided him, their eyes averted, faces pale with unspoken fear. Desperate for answers, Caleb returned to the bookstore, but it was empty. A thick layer of dust coated the counter as if no one had set foot in the shop for years. As he retraced his steps from the previous night, he noticed something odd. Each building had an iron gate covered in thick, rusted chains, as if trying to contain something sinister. His thoughts were interrupted by a young girl who appeared out of nowhere, clutching a tattered doll. She looked up at him with wide, knowing eyes and whispered, "The village needs someone new, to keep it from vanishing." That night, Caleb's fear turned to terror as he realized he was trapped in an endless cycle. Each evening, the village disappeared, leaving only him in the thick, all-consuming fog. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and relentless, and the villagers vanished with it, their faces fading as though they were never truly there. The young girl's words echoed in his mind, "The village needs someone new." Caleb fought against the pull of the fog, retreating into his room as the haunting cries of the villagers filled the air. Their faces appeared in the walls, stretching and contorting as they clawed to escape, begging him to stay and break the curse. But Caleb knew the truth now. anyone who tried to leave would be claimed by the village, their soul bound to its cursed streets forever. By the third night, Caleb's strength was fading, his mind slipping into a frenzy of fear and hopelessness. He paced the room, watching as shadows danced across the walls, twisting into familiar shapes, the villagers' faces. He could feel their agony, hear their desperate cries, and see their skeletal hands reaching out for him, pulling him toward the darkness. A figure appeared at his door, the girl with the doll, her face now pale and hollow. She stepped inside, her eyes gleaming with an ancient malevolence. "We were waiting for you," she said softly. "To lift the curse, you must give yourself willingly." Desperation overtook him. Caleb ran through the fog, feeling the village tighten around him like a noose. Just as he thought he might escape, the fog consumed him, pulling him into its depths as the haunting cries of Raven's Hollow rang in his ears. Caleb awoke, disoriented, on the cold cobblestone street with a deep sense of dread. The fog was denser, nearly suffocating, and the village around him looked warped, like a twisted reflection in a shattered mirror. He staggered to his feet and realized he was no longer alone. Shadows surrounded him, shifting forms of villagers, their faces blurred and hollow, watching him with eyes devoid of life. Desperate to escape, Caleb sprinted down an unfamiliar alley, but as he turned each corner, the village seemed to change, as if rearranging itself to keep him trapped. Walls appeared where streets should have been, doors vanished, and windows sealed shut. The village had become a labyrinth, a living entity determined to keep him inside. At the end of a narrow alley, he saw an ancient, decrepit church. The windows were shattered, and the steeple was twisted like a skeletal finger reaching into the night sky. Compelled by an unseen force, Caleb entered. Inside, the air was thick with decay, and rows of empty pews stretched before him like rows of graves. In the flickering candlelight, he could make out an altar, and above it, a massive, cracked mirror loomed. As he approached the mirror, Caleb felt a chilling breeze against his skin. Though the air was still, shadows began to move within the glass, swirling and merging until faces began to emerge. Villagers stared back at him, their expressions filled with sorrow and rage. Among them, he recognized some of the faces he had seen over the past days, including the little girl and the innkeeper. The reflections began to whisper, their voices overlapping in a maddening chant, "Stay with us. Stay with us. You belong to Raven's Hollow now." Caleb's heart pounded as he tried to look away, but the mirror seemed to pull him closer, drawing him into its nightmarish depths. His own reflection changed, his face paling and his eyes hollowing out, mirroring the villagers' haunting expressions. Unable to tear himself away, Caleb stumbled backward, feeling as though the mirror had absorbed a part of his soul. The whispers grew louder, accusing, each one a tortured voice recounting its story. They were all travelers, like him, ensnared by the village's curse, doomed to vanish every night only to return, their spirits forever trapped. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Caleb remembered the journal he had found earlier in his room, a dusty, forgotten book that mentioned a ritual to escape the curse. Desperate for any chance, he fled the church and rushed back to his room at the inn, the fog twisting and closing in around him. Inside, he flipped through the journal, his trembling fingers searching for the passage he'd read. Finally, he found it, a ritual that could break the curse, but it required a willing sacrifice. Caleb's heart sank. The curse could only be lifted if he gave himself willingly to the village, to replace the souls lost centuries ago. He considered his options, the faces of the villagers haunting his mind, the fear of eternal entrapment tore at him, but so did the thought of condemning others to suffer as he had. Determined to end the curse, Caleb resolved to perform the ritual. Under the blood-red moon, Caleb returned to the church, where the villagers' shadows awaited him in the mirror. He took his place before the altar, whispering the incantations from the journal. The words tasted bitter, as if they had been spoken by hundreds before him, each one sealing their fate. As he chanted, a figure materialized in the mirror, a cloaked figure with hollow eyes, watching him with a malevolent grin. The air grew colder, and shadows wrapped around Caleb like icy chains. He felt his spirit begin to waver, slipping from his body as if the village itself was devouring him. In that moment, he saw the villagers' faces soften, their eyes grateful. They began to fade, disappearing from the mirror, their souls finally released, the figure's grin vanished, replaced with fury as it realized the curse was breaking. The church began to crumble, walls and ceiling collapsing around Caleb. In the midst of the chaos, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. His body dissolved into the fog, merging with the village itself, his sacrifice freeing the trapped souls forever. Months later, a new traveler found themselves lost on a winding road near a long-forgotten place. They stumbled upon a small stone where the entrance to Raven's Hollow once stood, now overgrown and silent. An inscription read, "To those who sacrificed, to those who freed the damned." After reading the inscription on the stone, the traveler felt an unshakable chill. They turned to leave, walking back to the main road with hurried steps, feeling as though something was watching them from the trees. As they walked, the fog grew thicker, cloaking the road in a dense veil that seemed to swallow all light. Just as they were about to reach their car, a faint voice drifted from behind them. It was barely audible, carried on the wind, but the words were unmistakable. "Just one night, stay with us." The traveler froze, heart pounding, and looked back. Through the fog, they saw what appeared to be faint figures, the silhouettes of people staring back at them with hollow, vacant eyes. A girl's faint giggle echoed from somewhere in the fog, chilling the air even further. The shapes grew clearer as they moved closer, until the traveler could make out old-fashioned clothes and pale, expressionless faces. The same girl's voice, soft but insistent, whispered once more, "Stay with us, please." Panic overtook the traveler as they broke into a run, but the fog thickened, each step feeling slower, as though the ground itself resisted their escape. The air became dense, their vision dimming until they could hardly see their own hands. As the traveler reached the car, they fumbled for their keys, trembling, but when they unlocked the door and looked up, the car seemed wrong. It was rusted, aged as if it had been abandoned for years. The traveler turned to the road, only to find that it, too, looked different. The asphalt was cracked and broken, weeds sprouting through gaps as though no one had driven on it in decades. The air around them felt heavier, pressing down as if to consume them. They stumbled back, feeling as though the village was pulling them in. In the fog, faint figures lingered, whispering softly, their words swirling together in an incoherent chant, lulling, beckoning. But just as the traveler's resolve began to wane, they heard a familiar voice cut through the whispers, a deep, steady voice, filled with strength. It was Caleb's voice, echoing faintly from within the fog, saying, "Run, don't look back." With one last surge of strength, the traveler turned, sprinting blindly through the haze. The thick fog began to dissipate with each step until they could finally see the faint glow of daylight breaking through. The whispers faded, replaced by the distant sound of birds and the warm embrace of sunlight. The fog cleared entirely as they broke through the tree-line, finally back on the main road, the village nowhere in sight. They glanced back one last time, seeing only an empty stretch of forest. Breathing heavily, they got into their car, its paint now shiny and unmarred. Heart racing, they drove away, the village's curse left behind, or so they thought. For weeks after the escape, the traveler could not shake the feeling that they were not alone. Shadows seemed to move just out of sight, whispers echoed faintly in empty rooms, and at night, they would often hear soft footsteps outside their door. The curse of Raven's Hollow had left its mark, and the village's plea echoed in their mind, "Stay with us, just one night." And every night, just as they drifted to sleep, the traveler would hear the final whisper, a voice that no one else could hear, "Once you enter, you're never truly free." Weeks passed since the traveler's escape from Raven's Hollow, but they found no relief in the outside world. Every night, just as sleep threatened to claim them, faint whispers slipped through the walls of their bedroom, carrying the same unsettling plea, "Stay with us, just one night." They tried to ignore it, to believe that it was only the remnants of a bad memory, but the whispers grew louder, creeping closer each night, until they could no longer deny the presence that haunted them. Shadows appeared to dart in corners, unexplainable chills filled empty rooms, and the traveler felt an unshakable pull to return to the village. Sleep became impossible, fear was constant, and finally, desperation led them to make a fateful decision, to return to Raven's Hollow and confront whatever curse had bound itself to them. Arriving once more at the entrance to the hidden village, the traveler found it unchanged, as if it had been waiting, frozen in time. the silence was even more oppressive than before, and the air was thick with the same fog that had once enveloped them. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but an invisible force seemed to guide their steps. As they walked deeper into the village, they noticed that the doors of the houses stood open, as if inviting them in. Inside each home were fragments of lives abandoned in mid-motion, plates with dusty remnants of food, toys lying discarded, chairs pushed back from tables as if the inhabitants had fled in haste. The atmosphere was suffused with a feeling of dread, and the traveler could feel unseen eyes watching their every move. They wandered, drawn toward an old, decrepit building that they hadn't noticed before. The structure seemed to lean forward, dark and imposing, with windows that reflected nothing but darkness. Driven by a strange compulsion, they stepped inside. Within, the rooms were shadowed and silent, save for faint footsteps echoing from above. The traveler felt a chill run through their spine as they ascended the creaking staircase, each step adding to a growing sense of horror. Reaching the top floor, they found a single room, its walls lined with cracked mirrors. In the center, a chair sat, facing a grand mirror that seemed almost alive. Curiosity mingled with terror as the traveler approached the mirror, seeing their own reflection staring back, eyes wide with fear. But then, another face appeared beside theirs in the mirror, a figure with hollow, dark eyes, whispering words they couldn't quite hear. Paralyzed, they watched as the figure's hand reached toward them through the mirror, stretching impossibly toward their own hand. The mirror pulled them closer, and they felt themselves losing grip on reality. The reflection began to speak in a guttural, echoing voice. "You left, but you never truly escaped. Your soul is bound to us, and you shall wander with us, eternally." Desperate, the traveler stumbled back, breaking the mirror with a frantic push. As shards of glass fell, a heavy mist seeped out, filling the room and choking the air. The whispers returned, surrounding them, louder and more frantic, as ghostly figures emerged from the broken pieces, each one a former resident of the village, their faces twisted in eternal suffering. They cried out, voices merging into a cacophony of agony, and the traveler realized with a sinking dread that these figures had once been travelers like them, drawn to the village, only to become permanent residents, trapped between life and death. Panicked, the traveler backed against the wall, pleading with the shadows that encircled them. They offered anything, life, memory, freedom, if only they could escape this fate. But the shadows only laughed, whispering in mocking tones, "There is only one way, become one of us, or bring another in your place." A horrifying choice lay before them: remain bound to Raven's Hollow or lure an unsuspecting soul to the village. Realizing there was no escape otherwise, the traveler made a chilling decision. They would find another, someone who would come willingly, just as they had once done. With this dark pact made, the fog began to clear, and they found themselves back in the forest, the village hidden once more. The traveler returned to the world, haunted by their choice and yet bound to the curse. They began their search, looking for the perfect candidate, someone curious and fearless, drawn to mystery, and one fateful night, they found that person, speaking of Raven's Hollow in hushed, excited tones, intrigued by the village's legends. Without hesitation, the traveler guided the newcomer to the village, watching with grim satisfaction as the mist swallowed them whole. The deal was complete, but as they turned to leave, a cold wind brushed their neck, and a familiar voice echoed from the village depths, "Once you enter, you're never truly free." And they realized with dread that the curse had never truly released them, for the village's curse was eternal, and it would call for them again, just as it had always done. For weeks after abandoning the last traveler to Raven's Hollow, the original traveler found no peace. Though they had sacrificed another to secure their escape, the curse persisted, and the village still held its claim over them. Every reflection, every darkened corner, seemed to hide an ominous reminder of the village's eternal grasp. Whispers continued to haunt their nights, and in the dim light of dawn, shadows moved just outside their vision. They began to see the faces of the cursed villagers in dreams and hear their pained voices crying out in agony. The burden of guilt weighed on them, yet a part of them still felt bound, as though invisible chains pulled them back toward the village. Driven by a mixture of terror and desperation, they returned to the forest once more, hoping to confront the curse and perhaps, somehow, break it. Upon entering the forest, the fog seemed to thicken, clinging to the trees and blocking all light. No longer did they see familiar landmarks. Instead, the path twisted unnaturally, leading them in circles as mocking laughter echoed through the woods. Hours passed, and just as exhaustion threatened to overtake them, they stumbled upon an old wooden sign that hadn't been there before. The faded letters read, "Once you return, there is no leaving." A chill ran down their spine as they realized the forest itself was conspiring to keep them trapped. They tried to retrace their steps, but the trees seemed to shift, blocking their way, guiding them toward the village like an unseen hand was steering them back. Finally, Raven's Hollow appeared before them, shrouded in the familiar oppressive silence, yet this time, the village looked even more decayed, as though centuries had passed since their last visit. Doors swung open and closed in the wind, and the whispering voices filled the air, louder and more insistent than before. As they moved through the village, they were drawn to the heart of it, the town square, where a dilapidated fountain stood, its once clear water now black and thick. Around it were the spectral figures of the villagers, watching them with eyes full of resentment and anger. In their midst stood the last traveler they had brought here, the one they had sacrificed. "Why did you bring me here?" the spirit demanded, its hollow voice echoing through the square. "Why did you trade my life for your freedom?" The traveler tried to explain, but their voice failed them, the guilt and terror choked them, and the spirits of the villagers closed in, their shadows stretching, merging, and reaching out like claws. Desperate, the traveler cried out, pleading for a chance to redeem themselves. They offered anything, begged for mercy, and the shadows seemed to pause, considering the offer. Finally, a voice, deep and otherworldly, answered from within the darkness, "To escape the village, you must become part of it, sacrifice your freedom, and you will take the place of another." The traveler's mind reeled. It was a bargain more horrific than they could bear, yet they knew that refusing would trap them here forever. With trembling hands, they agreed, whispering their consent to the village. The shadows lifted, and the figure of the last traveler stepped forward. "The village will always demand a soul," they said softly, their voice echoing, "Tonight, it demands yours." As the darkness engulfed them, the traveler felt a strange transformation taking place. Their body grew colder, their senses faded, and their vision blurred, replaced by the flickering light of the village streets and the murmur of voices in the distance. They had become one of the cursed villagers, bound eternally to Raven's Hollow, cursed to wander its empty streets, lost and forgotten by the outside world. In the weeks that followed, a new traveler would inevitably stumble upon the village, drawn in by curiosity in tales of the mysterious, disappearing town. And the traveler, now one of the cursed, would watch silently as the cycle began again, knowing that one day they, too, would be called upon to lure another soul into the village's grasp. Time in Raven's Hollow no longer held any meaning. Days and nights bled into each other in a colorless haze, and the traveler, now part of the village, was bound to the shadows, forced to linger in the places they had once feared. They watched as new faces wandered through, each one carrying the same bewildered expression of fear and desperation, but now, the traveler was powerless to warn them. One evening, as the mist rolled thickly over the village, another traveler, a young woman, stumbled into the square, her face pale, her breath visible in the cold night air. She looked around frantically, calling out for help, her voice echoing through the empty streets. As the traveler, now a mere shade, approached, they recognized something familiar in her eyes, the same fear that had gripped them upon their own arrival. Unable to speak, the former traveler reached out, their hand passing through the air like smoke. The woman shivered, sensing the touch but unable to see its source. She spun around, peering into the darkness, her eyes wide with terror. "You won't find peace here," a voice whispered to the shade, coming from the darkness itself. It was the village, speaking through the mist, an ancient, mocking presence. "You are bound to this place as long as it draws breath from the living." Desperation gnawed at the traveler's soul. Their essence was pulled between two worlds, existing only to serve the village's insatiable need, but deep inside, a flicker of hope remained, a defiant ember that refused to be extinguished. They began to search for a way to reach the living, to somehow break the curse. In the ruins of what had once been the town's chapel, the traveler stumbled upon a dusty, broken mirror. The glass was warped and cracked, and yet it seemed to glow faintly, as if imbued with some dormant power. Gazing into its fractured surface, they caught a glimpse of themselves, not as a ghostly apparition but as they had been, a living, breathing soul. Desperate, the traveler reached out to touch the mirror, and for the first time, they felt something solid beneath their fingers. The mirror seemed to pull them in, its light intensifying, casting shadows that flickered and danced like flames. And then, they heard a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from the mirror itself: "Sacrifice must be met with sacrifice. Only then will you be free." The traveler knew that whatever lay beyond this mirror was their only chance. They needed another to take their place, a soul to satisfy the village's dark hunger. But the thought of condemning another weighed on them like an anchor, dragging them further into despair. Suddenly, the mist shifted, revealing a man wandering into the square, a newcomer. The traveler watched as the man stopped by the fountain, glancing around in confusion. Shadows clung to him like a shroud, and the traveler realized he, too, was already marked by the village. Driven by desperation, the traveler reached out through the mirror's surface, calling to the man. Their voice was barely a whisper, but the man turned, his eyes wide with fear as he locked onto the faint image in the mirror. "Take my place," the traveler whispered, their voice laced with an eerie calm. "Break the cycle, it's the only way." The man shook his head, backing away, his face pale as he realized the horror of the bargain. But the traveler's hand was relentless, reaching through the mirror, and the man's resistance waned. He was drawn forward, his hand meeting the glass, merging with it as the village's power took hold. And then, with one final pull, the man vanished into the mirror, his image merging with the traveler's. The traveler awoke with a start, gasping for air. The sky was a pale, faded blue, and the village lay silent around them. They touched their face, their chest, their body was solid, real, they were free, and the village's chains had loosened. Behind them, however, the man's image flickered within the mirror, his face twisted in horror as he realized his fate. But as the travelers stumbled away from the chapel, a chill crept up their spine. They glanced over their shoulder to see the villagers watching from the shadows, their faces empty and unreadable. The village was silent, but the traveler felt its promise lingering in the air. As they reached the forest's edge, the mist cleared, revealing the faint outline of a distant town, but just as hope began to bloom within them, a voice, ancient and mocking, echoed from the depths of the village. "Run if you can, but remember, the village never forgets." The traveler broke into a sprint, their heart pounding, racing against the inevitable, yet as they ran, they could still hear the soft whispers following them, carrying the village's haunting promise: it would always return for them, one way or another. The mist thickened, and the shadows danced, eagerly awaiting the day when they, too, would welcome the traveler back into the hollow heart of the village. With the traveler caught in an endless loop of horror, a fitting close for the Vanishing Village's haunting legacy.